Hello everyone, this is Johnny and welcome back. In today's video, I want to talk about my Japanese maple propagation schedule. Basically, at what points in the year, at what times in the year do I do each propagation method. I'm going to talk about when the best time is to grow Japanese maples from seed. We're going to talk about when to do cuttings. I'm going to talk about grafting, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit about air layering as well. So stick around if you're interested in propagating your own Japanese maples. First of all, I want to talk about growing Japanese maples from seed. It's definitely the easiest way to grow your own Japanese maples, and it's the way that I got started in growing them. If you've been following this channel for some time, you know that some of my first videos were discussing how I dig up Japanese maple seedlings in the mulched areas of my yard. And that's one way that you can go about, kind of a passive way, let nature take care of itself and then dig up little seedlings that you find under your Japanese maple trees or under maybe a friend's Japanese maple tree that they gave you permission to dig that up there. But you've probably seen these maple seeds, and Japanese maple seeds look similar to this. This is actually a seed from a big green maple tree. But the Japanese maple seeds look similar, but Japanese maple seeds actually form on the tree about right now, and I'll show you. They're starting to form on a few of my trees. But they don't actually ripen, and they're not actually ready till the end of the year, the end of the growing season, I should say, in the fall season. However, it's important to know that in order for these Japanese maple seeds to actually sprout and germinate, they need to go through a winter stratification process. So if you live in an area like I do where it gets cold enough in the winter, if the Japanese maple seeds can naturally go through that process, you don't actually have to do any kind of artificial process. If you live in a warmer climate, maybe like certain parts of California or other parts of the world that are a little warmer, where you don't really get into freezing temperatures, then you can artificially do this by sticking the Japanese maple seeds into like a refrigerator. And that's a good way to artificially create an environment that is like a winter stratification. So when it comes to my preferred method, since I live in an area where it gets cold enough in the winter to go through the winter stratification process naturally for the seeds, I like to let nature take care of itself. So number one, I do dig up a number of the Japanese maple seedlings that naturally come up in the mulched areas of my yard. But this past fall, what I did, and it worked really well, is I took a number of Japanese maple seeds and I put them in a box that had some soil in it, just a wood box, kind of a medium-sized box, about the size of a 10-20 tray. And I just put a little bit of soil over that, and then I stuck that out in an area that would get rained upon, snowed upon. It would get moisture, and it would go through the natural cold stratification process. And then this spring, a bunch of those did go ahead and sprout, and I've potted those up. So once again, if you live in an area where it gets cold enough in the winter, you can let this process happen naturally, either by sowing them in a raised bed or something like that, where you can slightly cover them with soil and just let them go through that natural process. Or if you live in a warmer climate, then go ahead and collect the seeds in the fall, put them in a little baggie, and put those in the refrigerator. Maybe give them just a little bit of moisture in a moist paper towel or something like that. A lot of people do that. Stick those in the refrigerator. Let those go until sometime probably around January or so, depending on how your weather is. And then go ahead and sow those in some soil and let that sit outside. And you should, a few months later, when your Japanese maple trees actually start to leaf out, see some of these start to sprout. Of course, when they do sprout, as I've talked about in the past, you want to wait for the Japanese maple trees to get their true leaves. And so this is an example of a plant that I potted up earlier this year. And you can see the true leaves here. The first leaves that come out initially are just these little guys here, but when it actually develops its true leaves, then you can pot it up, and I like to pot them up with just a good standard potting soil. I use G&B Organics traditionally. I use some other soil sometimes, but generally I like to use G&B Organics. But you can pot those up in a little, like say 3.5-inch square pot like this one, and then after a year, that particular tree will grow up to be about this size. And so it's good to go in that same pot for a year, maybe a year and a half, and then you can pot it up from there as it fills out this pot with roots. So that's a really easy way to propagate Japanese maples, and once again, that's one of the first ways you can do it. Another way that you can propagate Japanese maple trees is from cuttings. Now there is a little bit of a debate on whether or not you can get a good, healthy, full-size tree with a Japanese maple when it comes to growing it from cuttings. Some people say that Japanese maples will never be a good, healthy tree if grown from cuttings, and you have to only graft them. And I'll talk about grafting, and that is the preferred method for propagating Japanese maples when it comes to specific cultivars in most cases. However, when it comes to cuttings, it still is worth your time because there are certain trees, and you have to do this a little bit by trial and error. Personally, I find there are certain cultivars that will actually root pretty readily and grow into good, healthy trees. I was actually talking to a person locally in my area. I bought a Japanese maple tree from his collection. And he was talking about, we talked a little bit about this debate about whether or not you can grow a good healthy tree, a good healthy Japanese maple tree from a cutting. And he talked about and pointed to, I think he pointed to at least one tree, there may have been two trees there that were full mature trees that he grew from a cutting. And I've noticed personally, there are certain cultivars that root more readily and that produce a healthier tree. Now I'm only a few years into this, but so far I've had good success, for instance, with my Amber Ghost variety. Now I actually sold those Amber Ghost cuttings that I took 2 years ago, but they were good, healthy, 2 years later, producing great little trees. That variety of Acer palmatum seems to do really well when it comes to cuttings. Another variety that seems to do really well when it comes to cuttings is Orangiola. And those trees rooted very easily, Acer palmatum, Orangiola. And those cuttings, which once again, I actually sold those this year, the ones that I did last year, and maybe I did some the previous year, I can't remember, but I've sold all the Orangiola cuttings that I made to people that were glad to have those. Also, last year, I rooted a Mikazuki tree cutting. And as you can see, less than a year later, because this was propagated in the summer of last year, so just slightly less than a year later, you can see just this is a good healthy tree. And this one developed, this Mikazuki developed a really good root system after just like four months or so of being in the rooting medium. So I am pretty certain that this is going to create a good healthy tree in the long run. Now one variety that is still, I'm not quite sure yet, is my Acer palmatum Alpenweiss. And I'll grab that tree and show you what I'm talking about. Okay, here's an Alpenweiss Japanese maple, and as you can see, it does have leaves here that are opening up, new leaves, and it has leaves here, so it's still alive, it's doing okay. But here at the top section, you can see a number of these leaves opened up this spring, and then they kind of shriveled. Now, this did open up earlier than all the rest of them, and maybe the cold got it. And I do see there at the top, there are some new little leaves opening up, so it'll probably be fine. But nonetheless, I'm not 100% sure on this variety yet. I'll probably do a few more cuttings on this, but I want to wait to see really how this develops before I do too many more. Now, just a minute ago, I said that I sold all my Amber Ghost variety that I did from cuttings, but I forgot about this one. Here's one, and I didn't mark it here. I think this was actually done last year. This could be from 2021, but I think I did this in the summer of 2022. You can see here, this Amber Ghost has turned kind of that summer color where it turns green with a beautiful veining. And this particular tree, once again, Amber Ghost I've had really good luck with doing from cuttings, and I believe this tree will grow into a really good, healthy tree in the future. And so that's an example there. Now, when it comes to actually the process, and I've shown you this in multiple videos, but basically the simple process is, if you want to take softwood cuttings, you want to take those cuttings in the summer. But personally in my area, I have to wait till June or July. June and July is really the best time to do cuttings in my area because the nighttime temperatures come up quite a bit, and they're above 50 pretty much every night in the summer here. And that allows for the root growth to be enhanced, it seems like. I know there is a certain temperature of the soil that needs to be reached before root growth really takes off. So I found that if I take cuttings, and once again you take a cutting just below one of the nodes, and you stick that down in a mix of 50% perlite, 50% peat moss, and then you use a good rooting hormone, like a rooting hormone gel, that I will show you in the future, once again when I take cuttings this year, and I've showed you in the past how I use. And you stick that in there and keep that in a plastic tote or some kind of other box or maybe a greenhouse if you actually have a greenhouse, where it can stay in a humid environment. And you don't want that to be in direct sunlight or else it'll shrivel up and just dry up. But you want to keep it in indirect light, and you want to keep it in a humid environment. Once again, I use a plastic tote box that I drilled a bunch of holes in the bottom and a few holes at the top. And you want to keep that misted. I personally like to mist it 3 times a day. And if you do that, after around 4 months or so, you should start seeing some roots in those particular trees, and they should root. Now, some of those spring cuttings that I did take developed into great trees, but the problem was I only had a success rate of like 10 or 20%, where in the summer my success rate was a little bit higher. Now, I did take some cuttings in June of last year, and I didn't have complete success. And that is one reason why some people like to graft, is because grafting can have a higher success rate than, say, doing from cuttings. And some of these are kind of finicky, as I mentioned. There are some cultivars that don't like to root very well or may never really grow into a healthy tree, but you kind of have to go by trial and error and figure out which of your cultivars will grow a great tree from a cutting. But once again, I do believe it's worth your time. Now, when it comes to hardwood cuttings are taken in the late fall, early winter time. You stick those in soil and you let those go through a natural winter process in, once again, about 50% perlite, 50% peat moss. But here are some of the hardwood cuttings that I took in January, and that may have been a little late. Maybe I should have taken them later in the fall. But I don't know if any of these are actually going to root. And so I can see that several of these look like they've dried up. I see one here in the middle that does look like it does have some new leaf growth that may or may not have roots. Earlier this year, several weeks ago, when I looked at it, none of these had roots. It looks like some of them still have buds that are opening up. There's a chance that some of these will develop roots. But so far I haven't had good success with winter hard cuttings, but I have had decent success at certain parts of the year with actual softwood cuttings. So for now, that's a process that I'm going to stick with. I may try again this fall, take a few cuttings and put those in this box and let that go through the winter and see if I have better luck. But for me, I've had better success with the summer softwood cuttings. Okay, so next let's talk about grafting. Grafting is a lot more popular when it comes to propagating Japanese maple trees when you want a specific cultivar. Here's an example, and I did show you this in the past video, but here's an example of an Acer palmatum alpenweiss that I grafted. I grew the rootstock here that you can see. I grew that from seed, and then this past summer, so this was July 6th of 2022, I grafted on a scion from my alpenweiss tree. And as you can see there, it's healing up very nicely. I'm going to go ahead and pull off some of these little leaves that are coming up from the rootstock. Once again, I want to encourage new growth on the grafted on portion and not on the understock root. But that's healing up very nicely. The tree looks nice and healthy, and that is going to be a good tree. Now, my first attempt at this, I did in July of last year, and I was able to get 7 of 9 trees. I believe it was 7 of 9 that were successful and were good, successful trees. I still have 5 of the 7 that were successful. One I sold, and one I gave to a friend locally. But these are working really well. So I've had really good success rate with grafting in the summer. Now, I did some grafting in January of this year, and I'll grab one of those trees. And so far it looks like my success rate for the winter grafting was not so good. So I did a video about winter grafting, and I did a little bit different method than some people do. What a lot of people do is they actually, they'll take their understock, and I read this and I haven't done it yet, maybe I'll try that this year. But when they want to graft onto it, they'll take the understock and they'll bring it into, say, a greenhouse, or if you don't have a greenhouse, maybe you could bring it into your house when it's dormant in the wintertime. And you bring it up to a warmer temperature and you get the tree to come out of dormancy. And then you graft on the scion onto that. And it looks like that's a better method for winter grafting. I didn't do the whole bringing the tree out of dormancy. I just grafted directly on during the winter because we weren't having an incredibly cold January where I was, so I thought it'd be okay. But I did 3 different trees, and I showed you that in that video. And none of them have had any buds sprout out. This one, it's hard to tell. Like when you scratch test it, it looks like there still is some green, so maybe it'll still make it. That doesn't look completely dried up, and I am seeing a little bit of green there with the scratch test, and the buds aren't completely dried up, but it's not doing anything yet. I'm giving it more time, so really the jury's still out on this one. But you know, hopefully one at least of 3 will make it with my winter grafting, but I've had much better success so far with my summer grafting. I'll put a link down below to the video where I showed you how to graft, and really the process for the winter and the summer are pretty much the same except for the care after you graft. So in the winter time, since there are no leaves, the tree is dormant on the scion or the understock, you don't have to worry about misting the leaves to keep them nice and fresh. I just personally put a bag over it, the actual scion that was grafted on in the winter time, and that should take care of it. In the summertime, you actually have to, number one, cut off a number of the leaves on that scion, so you only have a limited number of leaves. And then you want to keep those leaves wet and misted and protected in a humid environment. If you don't have a greenhouse, you can get away by putting plastic over that scion, that grafted branch that you grafted onto the understock, and you can keep that nice and moist. So it's still worth doing cuttings, but grafting is probably going to be a little bit more reliable in the long run. But nonetheless, do cuttings. It's definitely worth it, and there is a low investment there because you don't have to grow the rootstock. You don't have to wait for that. You can just do from cuttings. But nonetheless, cuttings are a great method. Last but not least, I want to talk about air layering. So last year I showed you a video of me air layering 2 different trees. One was an Acer palmatum pixie and the other was an Acer palmatum alpenweiss. I was able to get the alpenweiss to go ahead and root with my air layer, and the pixie did not. Here is that tree this year. This one did, once again, like the other alpenweiss cutting that I showed you, it opened up like several weeks before all the other trees, and we did have a colder spring. So what happened is those initial leaves that came out, I think they got some frost damage and they kind of crisped up. Now you'll notice too that I'm not really getting a lot of that alpenweiss variation in these leaves. I think it's just because the tree isn't completely happy yet. You do see there that there is some variegation starting, but I think in a long term this will be a good healthy tree. But once again, the alpenweiss, like the cutting, maybe it takes a little longer for the root system to grow, and maybe this will not be a good cultivar to do from cuttings or air layer in the future, but it's still alive. I think it still will be a good tree next year, and we'll have to see as we get throughout this season. Now when it comes to when I do air layering, I personally did air layering in the summer of last year. And I'll link to the video where I showed you the process. It's a pretty simple process, and I won't take you through that right now. But I did it in the summer. I think probably you could start a little earlier than that, maybe like May for a lot of people. I think a lot of people could start in May. May or June is probably going to be when you want to start your air layer, at least from my experience. Let me know in the comments section below if you have different advice than that. But as far as my experience so far, I think summer is going to be when I do air layers in the future. And I'll probably try 1 or 2 more this year. But basically it takes 4 or 5 months once you put on the peat moss or the rooting medium in a plastic bag, and you ball that around the branch where you cut off bark and created kind of an exposed section, so the tree, and put some rooting hormone on that, and so the tree actually wants to produce roots there. So once again, to wrap all this up, so far for me, summer propagation has been the very best. Grafting, summer, June, July. Cuttings, June, July. Air layer, maybe a little earlier than that, May, June would be probably better for air layer. Now I'm going to experiment a little bit with the winter method of bringing the tree out of dormancy, like in January of next year, and see if maybe I can have better luck with winter grafting, because winter grafting is practiced by a lot of folks. But if you're just starting out, I think maybe summer grafting might be better for you, at least in my personal opinion so far. Once again, seeds, they ripen on the tree in the fall, and then you sow those in the fall, either in the refrigerator with a little moist towel, little moist paper towel in a bag, and then you bring that out and put that in soil in January. Or if you live in an area where it does get decently cold in the winter time, then you go ahead and sow those in a little box or a raised bed or somewhere where you have soil where you can dig that up in the spring once they sprout out. So I do hope my sharing of my Japanese maple propagation schedule was helpful to you. Let me know if it was in the comments section below. And also, if you've had some success propagating Japanese maples by any of the methods that I talked about, share your advice in the comments section below as well. As always, thank you for watching.